welcome you to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast, and we are continuing our study of Job. We're in chapter 19, which is Job's response to Bildad. And again, I'm not looking at the interlocutors for the simple reason that I'm not confident that what they're saying is truth. But what Job is saying is truth, and so we're kind of narrowing the scope of this investigation to look entirely to what Job says. In order to understand it, though, as I mentioned last time, I think, and I should reiterate, proper understanding can only be in the context. He is responding to these interlocutors, to these comforters, and so that would be for another level of understanding, and that would take quite a commitment. But I wanted to look at Job, who is the example of perseverance and suffering, and see what logic enables him to take that stand and then display that virtue of perseverance. So chapter 19, then Job answered and said, and he's answering Bildad, of course, "How long will you torment my soul and break me in pieces with words?" I would think that if they are truly comforters, they would pause and hesitate. He has, this has gone on for quite a while now. We're almost halfway through the book. And they are offering no comfort at all. He's either, as they are taking it, defiant in his sinfulness and his hypocrisy, or, well, I don't think they entertain the idea that he's right. They feel that they're doing the right thing by defending God's justice. It's a matter of theodicy for them. They want to believe that there is a clear equation between suffering and misdeeds. And this book is standing for the principle that that's not the case. There is innocent suffering. Peter will say as much. There is suffering for our own sin, but there is also innocent suffering, and we are to meet that with perseverance, and Job is the example of that. So Job answered and said, "How long will you torment my soul and break me in pieces with words?" I think that sometimes when Job is talking, he's talking through the comforters to God himself, and I think that's the case here. There's really, he is tormented, and so that "you" is ambiguous. Is he talking to Bildad and the other companions, or is he talking to God himself? And I think that we'll get the answer to that shortly. "How long will you torment my soul and break me in pieces with words? These 10 times you have reproached me. You are not ashamed that you have wronged me." 10 times. That's the maximum amount of indignity that one can suffer. God suffers that when Pharaoh defies his command to let the people go 10 times in Egypt, and then Israel for 10 provocations dares the wrath of God, and for which sin they are buried in the sand, even as Egypt was buried in the sea. So 10 is the number of the fullness of defying wrath. And he said, you have 10 times you have reproached me. And again, I think that probably speaks to the comforters, and he is speaking to God through them. So he struggles with faith. His faith is not perfected, I think, as we can see. "You are not ashamed that you have wronged me. And if indeed I have erred, my error remains with me." He knows that somehow justice is not on his side when he is complaining against God. And I think that's a very good lesson. "If indeed you exalt yourselves against me and plead my disgrace against me, know then that God has wronged me and has surrounded me with his net." And I think that ultimately that brings the idea together that God is the one that is being charged here. Now he will do that, we were told earlier, without sin. He did not sin. And I think that's probably true in general, although God will call him to repentance at the end. It's generally true, but it is like with all of us that are fallen creatures. It is a struggle to maintain integrity, and all righteousness in the Bible is relative. Noah was declared to be the most righteous man in his generation, and yet he was sinful, as we know, for the sin in the tent. There is no one righteous but God alone. So that's clearly also taught. So all of our righteousness is simply relative. Know then that God has wronged me and has surrounded me with his net. And the net, I think, are these companions that do not let him escape. They will provide no escape from his misery. If I cry out concerning wrong, I am not heard. If I cry out, there is no justice. He's crying out, Sa'ak, to cry out in distress. There is no justice. The blood of Abel cries out from the ground, and clearly it is calling out for justice. Ironically, the blood of Christ will call out from the ground too, but it will plead for mercy. So there is a perfection in Christ that exceeds all of the creatures. He has fenced up my way so that I cannot pass. He has set darkness in my paths. The parallelism here, I think, is instructive. He's fenced up my way. He's caught in a net, and now he's fenced up so that he can't get beyond this impasse of suffering. And God has set darkness in his path, so he doesn't understand which way to go. And these are very painful expressions of tremendous distress, as we know. He has stripped me of my glory and taken the crown from my head. The parallelism again. He had known glory, now he knows suffering, and he doesn't understand the sequence. The Lord says it's necessary first to suffer and then to enter into glory. But Peter reminds us that the prophets of old struggled to understand how suffering and glory were related. And here, he has stripped me of my glory. That's the glory that he had before his suffering, which was marvelous and amazing. We'll see that elaborated upon when we get to his final defense in chapter 31, but the beginning of the book tells us how prosperous his way was. He has taken the crown from my head. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone. My hope he has uprooted like a tree. This comes back to the metaphors that we saw last time about how life can come forth even from a dead stump. And so even a tree can have hope. But if it is uprooted, then there is no hope. And I think he's saying here he had known prosperity, and now he knows adversity, which is how Solomon frames the question of life, one of the deepest questions of life, the theme of the book. He frames it in the sense of God has created both the day of adversity and the day of prosperity, and no man can figure it out. That's the whole purpose of Ecclesiastes, is to tell us that in the day of prosperity rejoice, but in the day of adversity consider. We cannot put these things together, not definitively and finally. So in Job, it's difficult because he had prosperity, and now he has had suffering. So the sequence is off. It's not a redemptive sequence. The redemptive sequence would be suffering followed by glory, but he had glory followed by suffering. But as we will see at the end, the suffering he presently endures is for a good purpose. He will encourage the faithful through every generation after him. He will speak truth of God that is incorporated into Holy Scripture itself. He will become a byword for patience, as we saw, and perseverance in suffering. So there's much good that will come out of this, but he cannot imagine it in his present condition. The horizons have to be enlarged, and they're not ones that we customarily address. we tend to think that if you are obedient, you should prosper. And that legalistic analysis is the source of much misthinking about God, whose ways are mysterious, and yet always, whenever there's evil, he will bring good out of it faithfully. I was thinking about Joseph in this matter, because much evil was done to Joseph by those that were closest to him, by his own brothers, and then by Potiphar, his Egyptian master. Much evil was done against Joseph. Especially, I think, it was the brothers, showing that they had no faith. At that time, they're willing to kill their brother. John would tell us that there's no love of the brother, there's no love of God, there's no faith. And so he tests them to see, and in his testing, when he meets them, he sees that they have learned to love one another, even Benjamin. And so at that point, he can reveal himself to them. And he does so. And he announces the principle, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So what was the good? He suffered all of that in order that he would be able to provide for his family in the time of famine. God had ordained the famine, and so that must come. But in order to preserve the house of Jacob, that the world might have a redeemer, he sent Joseph ahead of time, as is said, to prepare a place for the family of faith. Even as Christ has gone ahead to prepare a place for us. Joseph, that's part of the Joseph typology. Joseph went ahead and was given authority and dominion, and by his wisdom he had stored up enough to deliver not only Egypt, but the world around Egypt from the famine, from the consequences of the famine for 7 years, which would have consigned everyone to death, but for the wisdom of Joseph. And so he is able to witness to the God of the fathers, to all of those to whom he sold bread from all over the world. So the gospel will go out into all the world. And we too are encouraged by his perseverance. So there is a role for suffering in our lives, and that we might adorn, as Titus puts it, that we might adorn, and by our status of suffering in this world, that we might adorn the gospel. It's a beautiful thought. He says, he breaks me down on every side, and I am gone, verse 10. My hope he has uprooted like a tree. He has also kindled his wrath against me, and he counts me as one of his enemies. He's speaking here, I think, of God, and that's certainly his perception based upon circumstances. There is no joy in what he is undergoing. There is no happiness. Happiness is a treacherous word because it's totally dependent upon what happens. I think the better word here is joy. There is no joy, and yet there is a continuation of faith, as we will see shortly. We're coming to close to the center of the book, and so there's going to be a magnificent confession at the end of this chapter. His troops, that is God's army, comes together and build up their rampart against me. They encamp all around my tent. He has removed my brothers far from me, so he's taken away anyone who would be a natural companion and friend. He has removed my brothers far from me, and my acquaintances are completely estranged from me. They will not own him. They will not admit to knowing him even. My relatives have failed, and my close friends have forgotten me. It's the word of desolation that ultimately speaks of what he is suffering is the desolation of being separated from God. It's the cry of the cross, the central cry, the word of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? And because it seems to everyone that God has forsaken him, even smitten him, everyone abandons him. Those who dwell in my house and my maidservants count me as a stranger. I am an alien in their sight. I call my servant, but he gives no answer. I beg him with my mouth. The word servant is emir. It literally means he has in the ear, he's listening with the ear for the voice of his master, and his master calls and he says in Hebrew, Haneni, here I am. That's the cry. The emir in the ear is the servant who is listening for the word that comes to the ear by the master. And he says, I call to my servant, but he gives no answer. There is no Haneni, there is no here I am at your service. I beg him with my mouth. My breath is offensive to my wife, and I am repulsive to the children of my own body. So even his closest relatives, his wife and his children, have abandoned him. So it's a word of complete and utter dereliction. Even young children despise me. This is a theme that will emerge in his final defense in chapter 31. The youths, and these are the young children who in the custom of the East would show tremendous deference and respect to an aged man. Even they despise him. So it's showing the extreme of disregard into which he has fallen. I arise, and they speak against me. All my close friends abhor me, and those whom I love have turned against me. There's a real bitterness in that when there is such a betrayal that someone you've loved departs, and it's a tough thing in this life to endure. Those whom I love have turned against me. My bone clings to my skin and to my flesh, and I have escaped by the skin of my teeth. Literally by the skin of my tooth in Hebrew. I've heard this phrase. It's kind of a proverb of sorts. I escaped by the skin of my teeth, that is, by the narrowest of margins. I've heard it all my life, but it never quite made sense to me because the tooth has no skin. So I took a look at it, and I think I've got a better answer. He says that my bone clings to my skin and to my flesh. And he mentions skin twice. My bone clings to my skin and to my flesh. And then he says, I have escaped by the skin of my tooth, or teeth, as we say in English. So what is he talking about here? I think because he has wasted away physically, he is, as we would say, skin and bones. You can see his bones directly under the dermis level of the skin. And what that means is that there is no margin. There is nothing. Fatness in the Bible is an indication of prosperity. There is nothing. There is no margin. His bones are against his skin. And I think that's the same here. I have escaped by the skin of my tooth. The skin here of the tooth is the gum. And that's what I think is indicated here. He's escaped by the gum adheres to the tooth if it's healthy. And there is no margin, again. So he's escaped by that which has no margin. He's barely escaped, if he's escaped at all. My bone clings to my skin, and then likewise his gum clings to the skin of his teeth. In both cases, there is no margin. So I think that certainly seems to satisfy me and my curiosity about it. Have pity on me, O you my friends. He's pleading with them. Is there no mercy anywhere, compassion, for all that has happened to this magnificent man who was famous in all the East? Is there no pity? But there is only the scorn and the attack that he must be exceedingly wicked and hypocritical because he's suffering so. There is no pity in that. For the hand of God has struck me. that certainly should cause us to have pity. Job had pity. We'll see that in his defense. He could pity those whose life was hard. So why do you persecute me as God does, and are not satisfied with my flesh? They're not satisfied, I think, is they're not cautioned by his flesh and sympathetic with his suffering in the flesh. I think that's probably the essence of it. And then he says this is fantastic. This is not the literal sinner, but it is the climax of faith. Oh, that my words were written. And to write down is to, they say that the palest ink is better than the strongest memory. He wants to memorialize this for all time. He says, oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that is for safekeeping, that they were engraved on a rock. So something that is more permanent than vellum or papyrus, that they were engraved on a rock and then with an iron pen and lead forever so that they would endure throughout the generations. He's about to say something that is a magnificent moment here. And he says it. He says it in verse 25. In spite of everything that has happened to him, he says, and what a triumph of faith this is, for I know that my Redeemer lives. And the word there is the beautiful word Goel, the one who redeems, the kinsman redeemer, one who is related to him, and he's lamented the loss of his kinsman. But there is one who is related to him, and that relationship will be in the common humanity, I believe. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand at last on the dust. It's not earth really, it's dust, afar. He shall stand at last on the dust. Standing is the posture of life. And so he will stand on the dust. That is, he will have the power of life over death. And he shall stand at last on the dust. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know. The skin that he talked about just immediately before. After that skin is destroyed, he said, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God. And I think he's talking about his Redeemer here, who will be both human and divine in order to satisfy the predicates that are laid down here. He's a Redeemer, so he's a kinsman. And he will stand at last on the dust. That is, he will arise from the dust, is the way I would take it. He will be able to overcome even death itself. And in overcoming death, he will redeem the state of Job. And he says, even if I die and my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God. What a tremendous statement of resurrection that is. Whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. He makes this emphatic. How my heart yearns within me. This is an attempt to translate a word that has a different meaning in Hebrew. The word is not heart, but kidneys. And that probably translates well, because kidneys, it was physiological psychology. Like when we're afraid, the heart beats heavily and fast within us. There are certain organs of the body that react to the conditions that we find ourselves. And the kidneys generally act when one is under stress and under tension. And so what he's saying in here is how my emotions yearn within me when he thinks about this. If you should say, how shall we persecute him, since the root of the matter is found in me? Be afraid of the sword for yourselves, for wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is judgment. And his final appeal is to judgment. He's going to say again that he wishes he could lay his case out before God. He would be happy to be vindicated. He would be happy to be condemned. He lacks the knowledge, And that lack of knowledge of why he is suffering in these conditions, when he had maintained such zealous righteousness, why is his portion to suffer? He wants to know. That's all he wants, is to have an answer from God and someone who can mediate between God and man. And we will see that the mediator who ultimately comes will be a divine man. What a perfect mediator is he, who is the Redeemer of all things.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. If you enjoyed this message, please be sure to like and subscribe to one of our channels so that you never miss an episode. We'd appreciate it if you could also leave us a review. You can find us on drwarrengage.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. To support the podcast and gain access to exclusive offers and content from Dr. Warren Gage, please visit our Patreon account at patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. We hope you join us next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast.